Once there was a small town located in the middle of a dense forest. The town was famous for its natural beauty and the friendly people who lived there. But there was something strange about the forest that surrounded the town. It was said that the forest was haunted by the spirits of the dead, and that anyone who entered it after dark would never return. One day, a group of friends decided to go camping in the forest. They had heard the stories, but they didn't believe in ghosts and thought it would be a fun adventure. They set up camp in a clearing and spent the day hiking and exploring the area. As night fell, they built a campfire and sat around it, roasting marshmallows and telling scary stories. But as the night grew darker, they began to feel a sense of unease. The sounds of the forest seemed to grow louder and more sinister, and shadows moved in the trees around them. Suddenly, they heard a scream in the distance. It sounded like a woman's voice, and it was coming from deep within the forest. The friends tried to ignore it, but the screams continued, growing louder and more desperate. Eventually, they decided to investigate. They grabbed flashlights and headed into the darkness, calling out for whoever was making the noise. But as they got deeper into the forest, they realized that something was very wrong. The trees seemed to close in around them, forming a dense maze that was impossible to navigate. The sounds of the screams grew louder, but they could no longer tell where they were coming from. And then they started to see things, shadows moving in the darkness, strange shapes and figures lurking just out of sight. One by one, the friends began to disappear. They were dragged off into the darkness, or swallowed up by the forest itself. The only one left was a young woman named Sarah. She was terrified and alone, but she refused to give up. As she stumbled through the forest, she began to realize that the screams she had heard were not coming from a living person. They were the cries of the dead, the souls of those who had been lost in the forest over the years. And they were calling out to her, urging her to join them in their eternal torment. Sarah fought back, using all her strength and willpower to push through the darkness and find a way out. But the forest seemed to be alive, a malevolent force that was determined to claim her as its own. And in the end, it was unclear whether she would ever escape, or whether she would become just another victim of the haunted forest. One of the friends in the group that went camping in the haunted forest is secretly a believer in the supernatural. They had only come on the trip to investigate the stories of the forest and to try to make contact with the spirits that were said to haunt it. As the night grows darker and the screams grow louder, this friend becomes increasingly convinced that there is something truly evil in the forest and begins to actively try to make contact with it. The other friends, who do not believe in the supernatural, are horrified by their friend's behavior and become convinced that they are endangering the entire group. As tensions rise and the group becomes increasingly divided, they must struggle to survive not just the horrors of the forest, but the conflict that threatens to tear them apart. As the night wears on, the group becomes increasingly tense and divided. The friend who believes in the supernatural begins to act erratically, insisting that they must communicate with the spirits and find out what they want. The other friends, who are skeptical and frightened, try to stop them, but their efforts only seem to make things worse. The friend who believes in the supernatural starts to hear voices in their head, telling them to go deeper into the forest and to make contact with the spirits. They become increasingly erratic and unpredictable, lashing out at their friends and becoming more and more convinced that the spirits are trying to communicate with them. Meanwhile, the other friends are growing increasingly frightened and desperate. They know that they must find a way out of the forest, but they are lost and disoriented, and the screams of the dead seem to be growing louder and more frequent. They begin to wonder if their friend who believes in the supernatural is right, and that they are all in danger from some unseen force. As the conflict between the friends escalates, they start to turn on each other, with accusations and recriminations flying back and forth. The friend who believes in the supernatural becomes increasingly hostile, convinced that the others are trying to hold them back from discovering the truth about the forest. The other friends, who are frightened and desperate, begin to lose their trust in their friend and become increasingly convinced that they are the cause of all their problems. As the night wears on and the conflict between the friends reaches its peak, they must face not just the horrors of the forest, but their own fears and doubts about each other. They must find a way to come together and work as a team if they hope to survive the night and make it out of the haunted forest alive. As the conflict between the friends in the haunted forest intensifies, the spirits that are said to haunt the forest seem to grow more and more powerful. Strange things start to happen, the trees begin to move and shift, the ground beneath their feet trembles, and the screams of the dead become louder and more frequent. The friend who believes in the supernatural becomes increasingly convinced that they are being guided by the spirits, and they start to lead the group deeper into the forest. They are convinced that they are on the brink of a great discovery, and that the spirits will finally reveal themselves to them. But as they get deeper into the forest, the other friends become increasingly frightened and uncertain. They can sense that something is terribly wrong, and they begin to wonder if they have made a terrible mistake in coming to the haunted forest. As the night wears on, the group becomes more and more lost. They are unable to find their way back to the campsite, and the forest seems to be closing in around them. They start to see strange shapes and shadows moving in the darkness, and they hear voices whispering in their ears. The friend who believes in the supernatural becomes increasingly convinced that they are communicating with the spirits, but the other friends are not so sure. They start to question their friend's judgment, and they begin to wonder if they are all in danger. As the conflict between the friends reaches its peak, the spirits in the forest seem to become more and more powerful. The screams of the dead become deafening, and the trees seem to be reaching out to grab them. The friend who believes in the supernatural becomes increasingly unstable, and the other friends are forced to make a terrible decision, whether to follow their friend deeper into the forest, or to try to find a way out on their own. With the rising tension and the growing power of the spirits, it becomes clear that the friends are in grave danger. They must find a way to put aside their differences and work together if they hope to make it out of the haunted forest alive. The friends find themselves deep in the heart of the haunted forest, surrounded by the terrifying screams of the dead and the eerie movement of the trees. The conflict between the friends has reached its peak, and they are at a breaking point. Suddenly, they hear a loud, unearthly howl that echoes through the forest. As they turn to face the source of the sound, they see a dark figure moving through the trees. It seems to be made of shadow and mist, and it moves with a supernatural grace and speed. The figure is heading straight for them, and they realize with horror that it must be one of the spirits that haunt the forest. The friend who believes in the supernatural steps forward, convinced that they can communicate with the spirit and find a way to appease it. The other friends, however, are terrified and unsure of what to do. As the spirit draws closer, the friend who believes in the supernatural begins to speak to it in a language that none of the others understand. They seem to be having a conversation with the spirit, and the other friends can only watch in horror as the dark figure moves closer and closer. Just when it seems like all is lost, the friend who believes in the supernatural suddenly stops speaking. The dark figure comes to a stop in front of them, and there is a tense moment of silence. Then, the friend who believes in the supernatural speaks again, this time in a voice that is loud and clear. They say that the spirit has been appeased, and that it will allow them to leave the forest unharmed. The other friends are stunned and relieved, and they begin to follow their friend as they lead them back through the forest. The screams of the dead begin to fade away, and the trees stop moving and shaking. It seems that the spirits have been pacified, and the friends are finally able to make their way out of the haunted forest. As they emerge into the light of day, the friends look back at the forest in horror and relief. They have survived a night that will haunt them for the rest of their lives, and they will never forget the terrifying power of the spirits that haunt the haunted forest.